Principal Richard Hale destroyed a future today. In Chicago's Lincoln Heights Academy, Maya Torres was expelled, her mother Eleanor's tears pooling on polished floors as signatures dried like verdict ink. The fluorescent lights witnessed Eleanor Torres beg for her daughter's second chance, but authority has no memory, only procedure. Hours later, a forgotten photograph surfaces from dusty medical archives. Elena, younger, breathless, performing CPR on a small boy whose heart had stopped on a playground 7 years ago. That boy was Hale's son. The principal who expelled her daughter once owed this woman everything. Now the debt breathes between them like an open wound that cannot close. The hallway stretched like a throat-swallowing light, fluorescent tubes humming their sterile song above Elena Torres as she walked beside her daughter toward the principal's office at Lincoln Heights Academy. Maya's shoulders curved inward, her backpack hanging loose on one strap, the girl's eyes fixed on linoleum tiles that reflected nothing but the grey ceiling above. Elena's fingers trembled against the strap of her own worn purse, the vinyl cracked from years of night shifts at Rush Memorial Hospital, her nurse's badge still clipped to the pocket of her jacket because she'd come straight from a 12-hour rotation without time to change. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and teenage sweat. Lockers slamming in distant corridors while the administrative wing remained tomb-quiet, as if silence itself were a form of judgment waiting to be pronounced. Maya had been accused of cheating on a mathematics exam, her test answers matching another student's line by line, the evidence presented by Mrs. Thornton with the clinical precision of someone who'd already decided guilt before investigation. Elena had read the accusation letter 3 times, her hands shaking each time she reached the words, "Immediate expulsion recommended," the phrase sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. Her daughter insisted on innocence, claimed she'd been studying alone in the library, that someone must have copied from her discarded practice sheets, but Lincoln Heights Academy had a zero-tolerance policy that treated circumstantial evidence like absolute truth. The school served Chicago's upper-middle-class families, children whose parents wrote checks for new auditoriums and science labs, while Elena and Maya existed on financial aid and the thin margin of scholarships that required perfect conduct to survive. Principal Richard Hale's office door stood ahead, like a courtroom entrance, the brass nameplate polished to cruel brightness. And Elena felt her throat constrict with the familiar shame of having to beg institutions for mercy they were never designed to give. She'd practiced her speech in the car, rehearsed the tremor in her voice that might sound like humility rather than desperation, prepared to offer community service or extra tutoring or anything that would keep Maya's college dreams from evaporating before they'd even solidified. Her daughter was brilliant with numbers, could solve equations that made Elena's head spin, had scholarship applications spread across their kitchen table like maps to a future neither of them could fully imagine. But institutions didn't care about potential when policy offered simpler narratives, when the paperwork demanded checkboxes that reduced human complexity to administrative convenience. The secretary, Mrs. Ambrose, gestured them toward 2 chairs outside Hale's closed door, her expression professionally blank, neither kind nor cruel, just the neutral face of bureaucracy performing its daily rituals. Maya sat without speaking, her hands folded in her lap, and Elena noticed how small her daughter suddenly looked, how the confidence that usually animated her features had collapsed into something hollow and resigned. 16 years old, and already learning that the world could erase you with a signature, could decide your worth based on assumptions you had no power to challenge. Elena reached over and squeezed Maya's hand, felt the cold fingers barely respond, and swallowed the rage building in her throat because rage had never changed anything in rooms like these. Minutes passed like sentences being read aloud, each second stretching into the weight of consequence, until the door opened and Principal Richard Hale appeared, his suit crisp and navy blue, his tie perfectly knotted, everything about him suggesting order and authority, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether institutions would protect him. He was 45 but looked younger, his hair still mostly dark, with distinguished grey at the temples, his handshake firm when he extended it to Elena, though he barely glanced at Maya. The office behind him smelled of leather and coffee, bookshelves lined with educational theory texts that probably hadn't been opened in years, diplomas arranged on the wall like shields against doubt. Elena followed him inside, her daughter trailing behind, and as the door clicked shut, she felt the air pressure change, felt the room become a space where her voice would never carry the same weight as his. Hale sat behind his desk and opened a manila folder, Maya's name printed on the tab, and Elena saw her daughter's entire academic record reduced to papers someone could flip through without ceremony. The principal's face remained impassive as he reviewed the accusation, the matching test answers, the recommendation from Mrs. Thornton, his fingers tapping the desk once, before he looked up with eyes that held neither malice nor compassion, just the flat certainty of someone who'd made this decision before opening the door. Elena leaned forward, her prepared words tangling on her tongue, but she forced them out anyway, speaking about Maya's character, her dedication, the impossibility that her daughter would risk everything for a shortcut she didn't need. Hale listened without interrupting, his expression never changing, and Elena realized midway through her plea that he'd already stopped hearing her, that she was speaking into a void where her testimony held no currency, where a single mother's desperation was just background noise to the more important work of maintaining institutional order. Richard Hale signed the expulsion form with a Mont Blanc pen his wife had given him for their 10th anniversary, the ink flowing smooth and permanent across the designated line, Maya Torres's academic career ending with the flourish of practiced penmanship. Elena had broken somewhere during his explanation of policy and precedent, her voice fracturing into tears that she tried to muffle behind her hand, her daughter sitting frozen beside her. And Hale had felt the familiar discomfort of witnessing emotional collapse without being moved by it. He'd handed Elena a tissue box from his desk drawer, where he kept them for exactly these occasions, and waited with professional patience for her to compose herself enough to leave. The mother and daughter had walked out of his office like refugees from a disaster they couldn't yet comprehend. Elena's sobs echoing down the hallway long after the door closed, and Hale had returned to his desk to file the paperwork. His day continuing with budget reviews and parent phone calls that demanded his attention more than the memory of a crying woman already fading from his immediate concern. Hours later, as afternoon dissolved into early evening, Hale received an email from the district superintendent requesting all emergency medical reports filed at Lincoln Heights Academy over the past decade, part of a routine audit checking liability insurance compliance. He'd delegated the task to Mrs. Ambrose initially, but she'd left at 5 o'clock and the superintendent wanted preliminary documentation by morning. So Hale descended to the basement storage room himself, a space he rarely visited, where old files lived in cardboard boxes labeled by year. The fluorescent lights down here flickered with a different rhythm, casting unstable shadows across stacks of forgotten paperwork, and dust particles swirled in the stale air as Hale began pulling boxes from metal shelves that groaned under accumulated weight. He found student health records mixed with maintenance logs, incident reports documenting playground injuries and allergic reactions, the mundane catastrophes of institutional childcare preserved in triplicate. The box labeled Medical Emergencies 2018 sat wedged between tax documents and outdated curriculum guides, and Hale had to yank it free, the cardboard splitting slightly at one corner as papers spilled across the concrete floor. He knelt to gather them, his suit pants collecting dust, when his hand landed on a photograph paper-clipped to an incident report. The image faded, but clear enough to stop his breath mid-chest. A woman in her early 30s, her face younger but unmistakably the same, bent over a small boy on asphalt, her hands positioned for CPR, her expression locked in fierce concentration, while other figures blurred in the background. Hale's fingers went numb as he recognized his son's face. Daniel's features frozen in the terrible stillness of a child whose heart had stopped beating, and the woman's name, typed on the report beneath, read, Elena Torres, RN, off-duty witness who performed emergency resuscitation. The memory exploded back into his consciousness, like a door he'd locked, suddenly kicked open, the afternoon 7 years ago when he'd received the phone call at work. The principal of Daniel's elementary school, speaking in that careful tone people use when delivering catastrophic news. His son had collapsed during recess, some undiagnosed heart condition triggering cardiac arrest. And by the time the school nurse reached the playground, Daniel had no pulse, but a parent picking up her own child had been there, a nurse named Elena who dropped everything and started compressions without hesitation, her training overriding panic while other adults stood paralyzed. She'd kept Daniel's brain alive with her bare hands until the ambulance arrived, her rhythm perfect, her determination absolute, and the paramedics later told Hale that without her immediate intervention, his son would have suffered irreversible brain damage within minutes. Hale had wanted to thank her properly afterward, had asked the school for her contact information, but Elena Torres had apparently declined to leave any details, had simply returned to her car with her own daughter and driven away as if saving a child's life were routine rather than miraculous. The school staff remembered her face, but not her name, and in the chaos of Daniel's hospitalization and subsequent recovery, the search for his son's savior had dissolved into the background of gratitude Hale expressed to doctors and nurses and the universe itself. He'd eventually stopped thinking about the woman who'd given him back his son, her face fading into the category of anonymous grace. A stranger who'd done what decent people do in emergencies before vanishing back into their own lives. But here she was, frozen in a photograph, her younger face staring up at him from the basement floor, and Hale's hands began to shake as the full weight of what he'd done crashed through his chest like a wrecking ball through glass. The woman he'd watched cry in his office this morning, the mother whose tears he'd ignored while signing her daughter's expulsion, was the same person who'd knelt on hot asphalt 7 years ago and refused to let his son die. Elena Torres had held Daniel's life in her hands and fought to keep his heart beating, had given Hale everything that mattered in the world, and he'd repaid that debt by destroying her daughter's future without a second's hesitation. The principal sank onto the cold concrete floor, the photograph trembling in his grip, Daniel's 8-year-old face staring back at him from the edge of death, and Hale felt something break inside his chest that no policy manual could repair. He'd been so certain this morning, so confident in his judgment, so secure in the rightness of institutional order, and now that certainty crumbled like paper walls exposed to flame. Hale sat in the basement among scattered files for nearly an hour, the photograph burning in his hands, his carefully constructed identity as a fair administrator dissolving into the recognition that he'd committed an act of profound injustice against the one person to whom he owed everything. The fluorescent lights continued their indifferent flicker, dust settling back onto boxes of forgotten emergencies. While upstairs, the empty school building held its breath around the principal, who'd finally understood what mercy looked like, and how completely he'd failed to recognize it when she walked into his office begging for her daughter's second chance. His son was alive because Elena Torres had refused to let him go, and Hale had just expunged her daughter from the institution he controlled with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten that power always costs something, even when you can't see the price being paid. Richard Hale drove home through Chicago traffic in a state of internal collapse. The photograph of Elena performing CPR on Daniel sitting in his briefcase, like evidence of a crime he couldn't undo. Every red light stretching into an opportunity for his mind to replay Elena's voice breaking in his office while he'd sat behind his desk unmoved. His house in Oak Park stood solid and expensive behind its perfect lawn. His wife Sarah's car in the driveway, warm light glowing through windows that promised domestic comfort he suddenly couldn't imagine deserving. He parked but didn't move, his hands gripping the steering wheel while his reflection stared back from the rearview mirror. The face of a man who'd believed himself just discovering he'd been blind. The night air felt cold when he finally stepped out. November wind cutting through his suit jacket, and Hale walked slowly toward his front door, as if approaching the scene of his own moral failure. Inside, his son Daniel sat at the kitchen table doing geometry homework, 15 years old now and healthy, his heart regulated by medication after the cardiac condition had been properly diagnosed following the playground incident. Sarah stood at the stove preparing dinner, her presence warm and familiar, and both of them looked up when Hale entered, their faces registering concern at whatever expression he must be wearing. Daniel asked if everything was okay, his voice carrying the casual trust children have in parents they believe infallible, and Hale wanted to confess everything immediately, wanted to spill the entire story across the kitchen floor, and beg his family to help him understand how to fix what he'd broken. But the words stuck in his throat, shame coating his tongue like ash, and he mumbled something about a difficult day at work before retreating upstairs to his home office, where he closed the door and sat in darkness staring at the photograph he'd brought home. Elena's face in the image held an intensity Hale hadn't recognized in his office this morning, her features compressed into absolute determination, every ounce of her being focused on keeping Daniel alive while the world fell apart around them. He zoomed in on her hands, positioned on his son's chest, proper compression technique, her nursing training evident in posture and positioning. And Hale remembered the paramedics telling him that her rhythm had been perfect, that she'd maintained exactly the right pace and depth despite the chaos and fear that would have paralyzed most people. This woman had given him back his son, had performed a miracle of skill and courage on a random Tuesday afternoon because she'd been in the right place at the right moment and refused to be a bystander. And today, when she'd sat in his office begging for mercy for her own child, he'd treated her plea like administrative noise, had signed the expulsion form while her tears fell, had sent her away broken because maintaining his authority mattered more than investigating the possibility of her truth. The guilt settled into Hale's chest with physical weight, pressing against his lungs until breathing felt like theft, because what right did he have to air when he'd suffocated someone else's hope without hesitation? He thought about Maya Torres, the 16-year-old girl whose face had been blank with shock during the expulsion meeting, and realized he'd never actually looked at her, had seen only a disciplinary problem requiring resolution, a case file rather than a human being whose entire future he'd just erased. The cheating accusation now felt hollow in retrospect, the kind of institutional certainty that protected the powerful from having to consider complexity or compassion. Maybe Maya was innocent, maybe the evidence was circumstantial, maybe Hale had destroyed a brilliant student's trajectory because zero-tolerance policies were easier than actual investigation, and he'd never know because he'd already decided her fate before she walked into his office. Sarah knocked on the office door eventually, asked if he wanted to talk, her voice carrying the concern of someone who'd been married to him long enough to recognize when his silence meant crisis rather than fatigue. Hale opened the door and told her everything, his voice cracking as he described Eleanor's tears and the photograph and the terrible recognition that had ambushed him in the basement. His wife listened without interrupting, her hand eventually reaching for his, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She reminded him that Eleanor had never sought recognition or reward for saving Daniel, had simply done what needed doing and disappeared, and maybe that same humility had prevented her from mentioning their connection during the expulsion meeting. Sarah asked the question Hale had been avoiding. What was he going to do now that he knew the truth, now that ignorance could no longer shield him from the weight of his debt? Hale didn't have an answer yet, but sitting in the darkness of his office while his son's life continued downstairs in bright normalcy, he understood that the principal he'd been this morning could never exist again. Elena Torres had saved the person he loved most in the world, and he'd repaid her with institutional cruelty dressed as professional duty, and no amount of policy justification could make that equation balance. The photograph sat on his desk like an accusation and a roadmap, Elena's determined face staring up at him from the past, and Hale knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next would require him to dismantle the very authority he'd used to break her. The comfortable distance between power and consequence had collapsed, and now he stood in the wreckage of his own righteousness, holding the evidence of grace he'd forgotten existed, facing the knowledge that some debts can never be repaid but must still be acknowledged, even when acknowledgement means destroying the version of yourself you'd built to avoid exactly this kind of moral reckoning. Dawn came grey and cold over Chicago, November light filtering through Richard Hale's office windows as he sat at his desk with Elena Torres's personnel contact information displayed on his computer screen, his finger hovering over the phone receiver without yet lifting it. He'd been awake most of the night, his mind churning through possible approaches, apologies that felt too small, solutions that seemed inadequate to the enormity of what he owed. The school building remained empty at this early hour, custodial staff still working through hallways, and Hale appreciated the silence because what he needed to do required privacy from the institutional machinery he'd served for 20 years. The photograph of Elena saving Daniel sat beside his keyboard, a talisman against the cowardice that suggested maybe he could simply reverse the expulsion quietly without confronting her directly, without making himself vulnerable to the judgment his actions deserved. He finally lifted the receiver and dialed Elena's number, each digit pressed with deliberate intention, his heart accelerating as the line rang once, twice, 3 times before her voice answered, exhausted and wary in the way people sound when unexpected calls arrive before sunrise. Hale identified himself and heard Elena's breathing change, tension flooding the silence between them, and he forced himself to speak before she could hang up or retreat into self-protection. He told her about the photograph, about the medical report he'd found in the basement files, about the recognition that had detonated his certainty like a bomb beneath his carefully maintained authority. His voice cracked when he described sitting with the image of her hands on Daniel's chest, understanding too late who she was and what he'd done, and Elena remained silent on the other end, neither forgiving nor condemning, just listening as Hale confessed his blindness. The principal told her he was reversing Maya's expulsion immediately, that he would personally investigate the cheating accusation with the thoroughness it should have received originally, that he would recommend the district expunge the incident from her daughter's permanent record entirely. But even as he listed these actions, Hale knew they were insufficient, knew that restoring what he'd taken didn't erase the trauma of having taken it, didn't undo the night Eleanor and Maya had spent believing their future had been demolished by institutional indifference. He told Eleanor she'd saved his son's life 7 years ago, kept Daniel's brain alive with her own hands while other adults stood frozen, and that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay, but had to acknowledge, even though acknowledgement exposed him as someone who'd failed to recognize grace when it begged him for mercy. The words felt inadequate streaming through telephone wire, but Hale spoke them anyway, because silence would have been cowardice, and he'd already been a coward once in Elena's presence. Elena's response, when it finally came, was quieter than Hale expected, stripped of the anger he deserved, her voice carrying the exhausted wisdom of someone who'd survived institutions crushing her before and would survive them again. She told him she'd never connected their past encounter with his current position, had simply seen another powerful man in a suit making decisions about her daughter's life without considering the human cost, had never imagined the principal expelling Maya was the father whose son she'd saved. But she also told him that gratitude didn't change what he'd done, that good intentions written on paperwork after the fact couldn't erase the night Maya had cried herself to sleep, believing her dreams had been erased, couldn't undo the shame Elena had felt begging someone to see her daughter as more than a disciplinary problem. She accepted his offer to reverse the expulsion, not because it balanced any cosmic equation, but because Maya deserved the future she'd worked for, deserved a school system that investigated truth rather than defaulting to punishment. Before ending the call, Elena said something that would stay with Hale for the rest of his career, words delivered without malice but landing with the weight of absolute truth. She told him that saving Daniel hadn't been heroic, had simply been what any trained nurse would do when a child stopped breathing, and that his gratitude, while sincere, missed the point entirely. The real question wasn't whether he owed her personally, but whether he'd learned to see the humanity in every parent who sat across from his desk, terrified and powerless. Whether this recognition would change how he wielded authority over people whose lives depended on his capacity for mercy. Elena told him that institutions forgive themselves too easily, that administrators like him could implement better policies and still sleep comfortably, while the people they'd broken carried scars invisible to official records. She wasn't asking him to suffer, but she was asking him to remember that power always has a human cost, and forgetting that cost made you the kind of person who signed expulsion forms while mothers cried. The call ended with Elena's simple acknowledgement that she'd bring Maya back to Lincoln Heights Academy on Monday, that they'd try again to trust a system that had already demonstrated its willingness to abandon them. And Hale sat in his office afterward, feeling both lighter and heavier, the expulsion form already shredded in his desk drawer, while the larger work of changing who he was stretched ahead like a road with no visible destination. He pulled up Maya's academic file and began the actual investigation he should have conducted before destroying her future. Reading her teacher's notes about her mathematical brilliance and consistent integrity, discovering the security footage showing another student hovering near Maya's discarded practice worksheets in the library, evidence that would take hours to compile but might reveal the truth he'd been too certain to seek originally. The photograph of Elena remained on his desk as he worked, her determined face a reminder that grace could arrive from anywhere, that the people we fail to see might be the ones holding everything together, and that some debts breathe forever, not as burdens but as invitations to become someone worthy of the mercy we've been shown when we least deserved it.